Good evening, and welcome back to Tranquil Arc Chronicles, endless horrories for sleepless nights, where forgotten histories wake gently beneath the shroud of time. Tonight, our lantern burns dimly against the fog of the 14th century. The Black Death has loosened its grip upon Europe, but its shadow still lingers like the scent of incense in abandoned chapels. Villages lie hollow, roads are empty, and in the echo of cartwheels on cobblestones, one can still hear the rhythm of prayers whispered for the dead. Among those who survived are men who carry not only the memory of the plague, but something darker, the memory of what they did to survive. And sometimes the past does not stay buried. So, as you settle beneath your blanket, let the world outside fall away. Listen to the soft roll of distant thunder, to the hush of wind through the hollow streets of Florence, and to the creak of wooden wheels upon rain-soaked stones. For tonight we follow one such man, Matteo di Rossi, a humble carriage driver who ferries souls across the night roads of plague-torn Italy. And as the bells toll midnight, he will take aboard a passenger he will come to know too well. Close your eyes. The rain begins to fall. The horses snort against the mist. And somewhere beyond the walls of Siena, a lone lantern sways in the dark, waiting. Chapter 1: The First Passenger. The rain had not stopped for 7 nights. It fell in sheets over the Tuscan hills, turning the roads into rivers of mud and memory. Matteo di Rossi hunched beneath his cloak, one hand tight upon the reins, the other clutching the little brass crucifix that hung from his neck. His horses, Bianca and Nero, trudged through the muck with the slow resignation of beasts long used to misery. The lantern hanging from the side of the carriage flickered in the wind, the only light between him and oblivion. Matteo had once been a merchant's courier, ferrying letters and passengers between Florence and Siena. But the plague had changed everything. The merchants were dead, their houses sealed with lime, and the sign of the cross painted in ash. Now Matteo drove whoever dared to travel, monks, mourners, and the desperate few who still believed the road could lead them somewhere untouched by death. It was nearly midnight when he first saw her. The figure stood at the crossroads beyond the ruined chapel of San Domenico, a woman cloaked in black, face hidden beneath a mourning veil. Her lamp cast no light, yet he saw her as clearly as if the moon had returned. Matteo slowed the horses. "Where are you bound, Signora?" he called, voice trembling against the wind. She raised her head just enough for him to glimpse pale skin, the glint of eyes like water in the dark. "To Florence," she whispered. Before dawn, Matteo hesitated. Florence was 2 nights' ride, the road treacherous even by day, but her tone left no room for refusal. He opened the carriage door, gesturing her inside. She stepped through the rain without a sound, without disturbing a single puddle. When the door closed, the horses shifted uneasily. Nero snorted, stamping against the wet earth. Matteo murmured to calm them and flicked the reins. The carriage rolled forward into the night. For the first hour, the silence was complete, save for the wheels against the road. Matteo tried to speak once or twice, but the words died in his throat. The air in the carriage felt wrong, heavier, colder. At last he asked, "Forgive me, Signora, but from which village do you come?" Her reply came softly, almost from far away. "From where the bells no longer ring." He frowned. "You mean the dead quarter." But that place, a soft knock, interrupted him. It came from inside the carriage. Once, then again, 3 times, slow, deliberate, like the striking of a clock. Matteo pulled the reins. The horses stopped with a lurch. His breath steamed in the cold air. He turned, half rising from the driver's bench, to peer through the tiny window into the cabin. The lamp inside was dim, but enough to see her sitting there, perfectly still. Only the veil had shifted, and beneath it, her face. He could not describe it later, only that it was there one moment and gone the next, as though the features were being swallowed by the shadows themselves. Eyes without shape, mouth without form. Matteo stumbled down from the carriage, fumbling with the latch. He opened the door and found the cabin empty. No footprints led away into the mud. No sign of a passenger at all. Only on the seat where she had sat lay a single silver florin, tarnished, impossibly old, marked with a cross that had not been minted for 100 years. The wind rose, the horses screamed, and from the distant valley a bell began to toll, soft, hollow, and wrong. Matteo did not move until dawn. Chapter 2. The tarnished coin morning came, but it brought no warmth. The dawn light over the hills of Tuscany was gray and thin, like the breath of a dying man. Mist still clung to the valleys, winding between the cypress trees like unspoken prayers. Matteo sat by the roadside fire, the horses grazing listlessly nearby. He had not slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw that empty carriage and the glint of that impossible coin. He turned it over in his palm again. The silver was dark with age, the engraving half worn away, but the emblem was unmistakable. A cross surrounded by 4 circles, the mark of the House of Visconti, rulers of Milan nearly a century earlier. Matteo frowned. Coins like this had vanished long before the plague, before his grandfather's time. Yet it gleamed with a faint, almost unnatural luster, as though it refused to tarnish completely. He muttered a prayer under his breath and tucked it into his leather pouch. The road called the next night. He was back in Siena, at the edge of the same ruined chapel where he had first seen her. And as the bell of San Domenico struck 12, the rain began again. He did not expect her to appear. Perhaps it had all been exhaustion or fever, or one of those ghost stories whispered by carriage men who drank too much wine and too little water. But when the final toll faded, she was there, standing in the same place, same veil, same silence. Matteo's heart turned to ice. He could have fled. Every instinct screamed to do so. Yet some deeper compulsion, guilt, curiosity, or fate made him lift the lantern and whisper, "Signora, you seek Florence again." She nodded once. This time her lamp flickered faintly, as though borrowing light from his own. Without a word, she entered the carriage. They rode through the mist, the sound of wheels echoing between dead vineyards. After a time, Matteo dared to ask, "Were you ever in Florence before the pestilence, Signora?" "Yes," came the reply. Her voice was distant, like wind through a tune. "I was there when the bells rang every hour, when the markets overflowed with olives and silk, when the children ran laughing through the Piazza della Repubblica." Matteo felt something cold in her words. He had heard tales of Florence before the plague, the wealth, the art, the laughter, all gone now. "What became of you then?" he asked softly. There was a pause. "Then I took the last carriage out. Before the gates closed, a silence thicker than rain followed." "The last carriage," Matteo murmured. "That would have been 30 years ago." "Yes," she said. "It was yours." Matteo froze. "Mine. But I wasn't yet born." "You were not," she agreed. "But your carriage was." Her words coiled around his mind like smoke. He turned slightly, trying to see her face through the window's reflection, but the glass showed only his own. Then he felt it. The air had changed. The horses' hooves made no sound. The rain had stopped. Even the creaking of the wheels was gone. He looked around. The world beyond the road had vanished. There was no countryside, no stars, no sky, only blackness, endless and perfect. Matteo's breath caught, Holy Mother of God. "Not all roads," she said, "belong to the living." The coin in his pouch burned hot against his leg. He pulled it out instinctively, and the instant he did, the world snapped back. Rain, wind, mud, the smell of horse sweat and wet wood. The carriage jolted violently, throwing him forward. When he looked again, the woman was gone, but something had replaced her. On the seat where she sat lay a second coin, identical to the first. Matteo didn't touch it, not this time. He drove until dawn, not daring to stop, until the first light of morning touched the walls of Siena that night. Matteo sought counsel at the Abbey of Monte Oliveto, a monastery renowned for housing scholars and chroniclers. Brother Lorenzo, a man of learning and superstition in equal measure, listened in silence as Matteo told his story. When Matteo finished, the monk took one of the coins, examining it under a candle. "This mark," Lorenzo said gravely, "is not merely Visconti. It was struck during the rule of Bernabo Visconti, known for his cruelty and his experiments with alchemy. He was said to have minted a set of soul coins, tokens offered in exchange for prayers of the damned. Matteo's skin prickled. "You mean to say?" Lorenzo nodded. "They were said to be cursed. Payment for journeys never meant to end." That night, Matteo made a vow never to drive again. But vows, like roads, have ways of turning back on themselves, because, as the bells struck midnight once more, he woke to the sound of hooves outside his door. His carriage, which he had left locked and empty in the barn, stood waiting in the road, lantern-lit, horses restless, and from within a woman's voice whispered, "Driver, to Florence, before dawn." Chapter 3. The Abbey Ledger. The next morning came heavy with sunlight. Rain had turned the monastery courtyard into a mirror of gray sky and muddy reflection. Matteo stood under the stone arch, the second coin clenched in his palm, feeling as though the world had grown narrower, like a corridor closing behind him. Brother Lorenzo led him through the cloisters, past walls inked with centuries of prayers, through corridors lined with skulls and relics. The air smelled of candle wax, mold, and something faintly metallic, the scent of parchment ink that had long since turned brown with time. They entered the scriptorium, where rows of wooden desks faced tall, arched windows. A handful of monks worked quietly, quills scratching like the sound of insects in a graveyard. "Sit," said Lorenzo, motioning toward a table in the back. "There are records, plague ledgers, confessional journals, and accounts of the roads that led through Siena in the year of our Lord 1374. Perhaps your ghost rides in one of them." Matteo sat, uncertain whether the monk was jesting. Lorenzo returned moments later, bearing a massive volume bound in cracked leather. Its spine was marked with a single word, Itinerarium Animarum, the Journey of Souls. Lorenzo turned the brittle pages with gloved fingers. The script was cramped, almost panicked, each line a desperate attempt to preserve something before the writer's own death. "These were written by the plague priests," Lorenzo explained. "Men who wandered from village to village, chronicling the dying. Some were half mad before the end." Matteo watched as Lorenzo's eyes scanned the faded lines. Then the monk stopped. "There," he whispered. On the page, beneath a series of death tallies, was a single account written in Latin, trembling but legible. "At midnight, by the chapel of St. Lucia, I saw the carriage that bears no wheel sound. Its driver's eyes were black as mirrors. Within, a woman clad in mourning silk did ride, though her face was shrouded in veil. She paid him with the coin of Bernabo, and he took it without confession. The carriage vanished before the dawn, and by morning the driver was found dead, his body cold, his eyes open to the sky." Matteo's breath hitched. The description matched his encounter exactly, every detail, even the silence of the wheels. Lorenzo traced the next line with his finger. It is said, the passenger comes not for the soul of the driver, but for the guilt he carries. For every sin untold, she offers another ride, and every coin marks a confession not given. He closed the book gently, as though it could awaken something if handled roughly. Matteo stared at him. You think I am being punished? Lorenzo looked tired. You are being chosen, but not by the living. That night, the rain stopped. The bells of Siena rang slower than usual. An omen, the old folk said. Matteo left the monastery with both coins in his pocket, intending to throw them into the Arno and be rid of them forever. But when he reached the riverbank, something stopped him. The water reflected not his face, but the face of the veiled woman, faint and distorted by ripples. You cannot cast away what is already yours, a voice whispered behind him. He turned sharply. No one, only the echo of hooves somewhere in the mist. The coins in his hand pulsed faintly with warmth, a heartbeat of metal. He dropped them both into the river anyway. They sank, vanishing beneath the black current. Matteo exhaled shakily, crossing himself 3 times before turning back toward his village. But that night he dreamed. He was on the same road again, the one between Siena and Florence, though the landscape around him was wrong. The trees were stripped bare, the soil gray, as if the plague had not ended but consumed everything. And on the horizon, the carriage waited. His carriage, lanterns dim, wheels still wet with the blood-red mud of some other world. The woman stood beside it. You have not confessed, she said softly. Her veil swayed in a wind that didn't exist. Matteo tried to speak, but his throat was dry, heavy with ash. What sin? He managed. You drove them, she replied. You left them. He shook his head. I never. Her hand lifted, and the dream changed. Now he saw faces, men and women he had once carried in his youth, fleeing the pestilence. He had left some of them at the gates, turned others away when fever marked their skin. He had taken their gold, knowing they would not live till morning. Their eyes burned into him now from the darkness, silent, accusing. Your road was their grave, the woman said, and now the road calls you back. When he woke, his hands were clenched around 2 coins, wet, cold, and shining faintly in the dark. At dawn, he returned to the abbey, coins in hand. But the gate stood open, and inside silence. No chanting, no voices. Every monk lay dead in their beds, peaceful, eyes open, like sleepers who had seen something too bright to comprehend. Only Brother Lorenzo's body sat upright in the scriptorium, his hand still clutching a quill. Before him, on the open page of Itinerarium Animarum, he had written just 1 line. The driver has taken his 3rd fare outside. The carriage bells began to ring, softly, insistently, and from beyond the abbey walls, Matteo heard her voice again, calm as prayer. Driver, the road awaits. Chapter 4. The Road Between Worlds. The sun never fully rose that day. A strange haze lay over the hills, not fog, not smoke, but something dull and unmoving, as though the air itself had lost its will to drift. The people of Siena said nothing. In times like these, they had learned silence was safer than explanation. Matteo left before noon. He no longer felt part of the world he walked through. The bells of the abbey still echoed in his skull, soft, uneven, as though rung by invisible hands. He took only what he needed: a loaf of bread, a flask of watered wine, and the 2 coins, though every instinct in him screamed to cast them away again. He had tried twice, and twice they had returned, once in his dream, and once in the pouch he had left empty. Now they simply were part of him. He followed the Via Francigena, the ancient pilgrim road that wound from Canterbury to Rome, passing through the Tuscan countryside. But as the miles passed beneath his boots, the familiar milestones began to vanish. The shrines, the mile markers, the crosses, even the birds fell silent. By evening, he reached a fork he did not recognize. The left path led to Florence, that he knew. The right was narrow, dark, swallowed by trees that leaned too close to the earth. No signpost marked it. Yet something, perhaps a whisper of the woman's voice, pulled him rightward. He followed it. The woods were older than memory. The air thickened, damp with decay and time. The trees grew so dense they shut out the sun entirely. Soon he could see nothing but the glow of his lantern and the faint silver glimmer of his horse's harness. Then he saw it, a marker stone half buried in moss. The inscription was nearly gone, but he made out 3 words in Latin: Via Mortuarum, the road of the dead. He froze. The name stirred something in him, a rumor he'd once overheard from old traders who drank too much wine. The pilgrims of the plague. Monks who, during the Black Death, carried bodies to mass graves outside the city's building, secret paths between cemeteries, so the living would never see the dead again. This was one of those paths. Matteo turned back, but the way behind him was gone. The road had twisted upon itself, leading only forward. Hours passed. The forest opened suddenly onto a wide plain. In the distance, a faint light shimmered like lanterns in a procession. Matteo urged the horse onward. As he neared, he saw figures walking beside the path. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds, draped in black robes, faces hidden. They carried torches, though the flames made no smoke. Their movements were silent, almost weightless. He slowed, heart hammering. "Travelers," he called. None turned to answer. He looked closer, and his breath caught. Their feet left no prints in the mud. He realized then the air was utterly still. No wind, no breath, no sound, only the distant hum of something vast, something ancient. And then the figures began to turn. One by one, the veiled faces lifted toward him, and beneath each hood he saw only mirrors, polished silver masks reflecting his lantern's glow. The procession stopped. From among them stepped her, the veiled woman, though now her gown was stained with river silt, and where her hands touched her veil, it seemed to smoke faintly, as though the fabric burned without flame. "You found the road," she said. "Few do without being called." Matteo tried to speak, but his voice failed. "You have ridden for the living," she continued, "but this road runs for the dead. You must carry one more fare, Matteo di Rossi, one final soul." He shook his head. "No more. I am no priest, no ferryman. You are both," she whispered. "Every man who takes payment for passage is." She gestured toward the horizon, where the faint outline of a bridge shimmered, stone arches rising from a black river that stretched beyond sight. At its center waited a carriage, identical to his own. "Take me there," she said softly. He hesitated only a moment before the world around him began to crumble, not with violence, but with decay. The air tasted of dust and ruin. The trees turned to bone, the ground to ash. He climbed onto the driver's seat. The horses, pale now, eyes white, began to move on their own. The procession followed in silence. As they neared the bridge, Matteo saw carvings etched into its pillars, skulls, hourglasses, and Latin inscriptions. One read, "Memento mori," remember, you too must die. Halfway across, he turned to speak to his passenger, but her seat was empty. In her place lay a single coin, blackened, but pulsing faintly. He stared at it, realization dawning. Each coin was not merely payment, it was a tally of journeys made, souls carried, sins unburied, and this was the third. At the bridge's end, a figure waited, tall, faceless, cloaked in darkness, deeper than night. It held no weapon, yet Matteo felt the air bend around it, as though it breathed gravity. The carriage stopped on its own. "Driver," the figure said, its voice a whisper of centuries. "You have crossed farther than most." Matteo swallowed hard. "Who are you?" "I am the collector," it replied, "of debts unpaid." "I owe nothing," Matteo said, though his voice trembled. The figure tilted its head. "You took their gold, left them to die. You carried the healthy and shunned the marked. You traded mercy for coin. Tell me, driver, how much is a soul worth on your road?" Matteo said nothing. The figure extended a hand. "Then I will take what you have left to pay." The black coin lifted from the seat, floating gently toward the figure. As it touched the shroud, light flared, bright, blinding, and cold. When it faded, the figure and the carriage were gone. Only Matteo remained standing alone on a bridge that no longer existed, beneath a sky that did not know his name. Some say travelers along the old pilgrim roads still see him, a lone carriage driver, lantern dim, eyes hollow with centuries. He stops for no one except those who carry guilt heavy enough to pay the fare. And when the bells toll midnight, the sound of unseen hooves echoes faintly across the Arno. Chapter 5, The Ferryman's Debt. The tale of Matteo di Rossi should have ended with his disappearance on the road between Siena and Florence. But death, like debt, has a peculiar way of accruing interest. Within a decade of that vanished night, whispers began to spread among the plague survivors, the pilgrims, and the traders who still dared travel the night roads of Tuscany. They spoke of a coach that moved without sound, gliding through the mist, its lantern dim as dying memory. Some swore they saw a driver, others that the reins hung loose in the air, guided by no mortal hand. And always, always the same hour, midnight. The Abbey Chronicle, -1384, in the archives of the Abbey of San Galgano. 1 decade after Matteo's vanishing, a monk named Pietro recorded a curious entry. The coach of Siena is seen again, thrice this winter. It travels not by wheel, but by shadow. The driver does not speak, but holds aloft a lantern that burns with no oil. When hailed, he offers passage to Florence for a single coin. Those who take it are never seen again. Brother Pietro went on to note that one of his own novices vanished after daring to mock the tale. The only thing found the next morning was a set of hoofprints burned into the frost, leading nowhere. The Merchant's Journal, -1391, in the private journal of Lorenzo Caprini, a spice merchant from Pisa. Another account surfaced. Returning from Florence by night, I passed the chapel of St. Lucia. There stood a coach, fine but strangely aged. The driver wore the garb of a century past, his face pale, eyes dark as old wells. He asked if I desired quick passage, and though his voice was low, it carried as if spoken within my skull. I declined, and he inclined his head in silence. But as he rode away, my horse reared in terror, for where the carriage passed, the earth left no track. Lorenzo never traveled by night again. He donated his fortune to a monastery and lived the rest of his days in quiet repentance. The Venetian folklore, 15th century by the early 1400s. The legend had crossed north to Venice, where it took on a darker shape. Here the story of Il Passeggero di Mezzanotte, the midnight passenger, became entwined with plague superstitions. Gondoliers whispered that sometimes at the 13th stroke of midnight, a black carriage was seen gliding across the surface of the canals. They said the driver wore a hood and bore a candle in his mouth, an offering for the souls lost to pestilence. To see the reflection of that carriage in the water was an omen of death within the fortnight. The city's chroniclers, skeptical as they were, could not deny the strange increase in drownings during the winters of 1402 to 1405. witnesses, often described hearing wheels, impossible wheels, rolling over the waves before the victims vanished. The map of the dead roads, 1478. Nearly a century after Matteo vanished, scholars at the University of Padua undertook the monumental project of cataloging ancient roads of the Papal States and Lombardy. Among the diagrams and manuscripts, one stood out, a map without origin, depicting a route labeled only Via Mortuorum. No record existed of such a road. Yet the mapmaker had detailed its intersections with real towns, Siena, Florence, Bologna, Lucca, as if it were both phantom and fact. In the lower corner, scrawled in Latin, was a note. This road may be walked, but not seen, taken, but not returned from. It begins where confession ends. The signature below reads simply, M.D. Rossi. The ink was fresh. The Alchemist's Theory, 1512. By the dawn of the 16th century, the story had mutated further, mingling with the rise of Renaissance alchemy. A Florentine philosopher, Girolamo del Nero, wrote a tract titled De Anima Peregrina, of the Wandering Soul, in which he proposed that Matteo had become a psychopompus, a conductor of souls between mortality and judgment. Del Nero described the coins of Bernabo Visconti as transmutation tokens, capable of binding a sinner's guilt to eternal service. The driver, he claimed, was cursed to collect these coins forever, each one a confession left unspoken, a fare left unpaid. The Church condemned the work as heresy, but the book survived. In its margins, modern historians later found sketches of a skeletal driver holding a lantern carved with angelic sigils beneath it. A note in Del Nero's hand, "There is mercy in repetition, if the soul endures the road long enough." The shadow of history. By the 17th century, the midnight passenger was no longer just an Italian ghost story. It had crossed borders, spoken in German as Der Mitternachtsfahrer, in French as Le Cocker du Néant, and in English as the coachman of the hourless road. What began as Matteo's penance had become Europe's cautionary myth of guilt, told by soldiers, sailors, plague doctors, and peasants alike. Each retelling bent the tale slightly. In Prague, the driver ferried heretics to their judgment. In Paris, he offered doomed lovers one final ride through Montmartre. In London, he was said to drive a plague cart, his lantern the color of bonfire. But one detail never changed. The road was always empty, the wheels always silent, the fare always paid in coins that should not exist. And yet, in the archives of Siena Cathedral, a parchment remains, dated 1642, written by an unnamed monk, likely a chronicler of the Inquisition. It ends with these words, asterisk, "Last night, as I crossed the Piazza del Campo, I saw a carriage standing alone. Its driver looked at me with hollow patience, as if he had waited long. When I drew nearer, He lifted his lantern, and in its glass I saw my own face reflected, aged and pale. I fled, but the wheels made no sound as he followed. This is my confession. I write it now, for I hear the hooves again. Asterisk the ink stops midline. Below it, pressed into the parchment, is a faint imprint of a coin bearing the Visconti cross. That was the last written account of the midnight passenger until the 19th century, when grave robbers near the old plague roads unearthed something beneath the stones of a forgotten bridge. The remains of a man bound in chains, seated upright beside a shattered carriage wheel. In his pocket lay 2 coins, fused together by age, their markings nearly erased, except for one, memento mori. Chapter 6. The Bridge of Echoes. The wind that swept through Florence in the first days of November 1374 carried a strange timbre, as though whispering beneath its breath, carrying words no mortal tongue could form. The river Arno flowed thick and black, swollen with rain and refuse. Bridges arched like the backs of ancient beasts over its restless waters, and the lamps that lined their edges flickered as if frightened of what lingered below. On one of those bridges, near midnight, a cab rolled through the mist, a lone shrouded carriage whose lanterns burned pale green. No one had built such a cab in years, and yet its frame gleamed as though newly polished. Inside sat a driver face concealed by a hood, gloved hands steady on the reins. The horse, a black stallion with silver eyes, breathed a cold fog into the damp air, and from the shadows of the alley a figure appeared, a man clutching his cloak tight against the drizzle. His name was Father Matteo Orsini, a parish priest of Florence, though few would have recognized him anymore. He had not slept in 3 nights, his eyes hollowed, his hands trembling not from age, but from knowledge, for he had seen something. A pale figure crossing the square at midnight, stepping into the same ghostly carriage each night. Matteo had once dismissed it as fatigue, as phantoms of grief, but tonight something compelled him to follow. The horse whinnied low as the carriage halted midway on the bridge. Without a sound, the door opened. Father Matteo, came a voice from within, soft, cold, and hollow, as though spoken through water. You've kept me waiting. The priest froze. Who speaks? You do not remember me. The voice asked again, calm, almost kind. I remember your prayers by the riverbank. You begged for the dying, did you not? You asked heaven to end their suffering. Matteo stepped closer, heart hammering. I prayed for mercy, and mercy was given, said the voice. The streets are empty now. No one suffers. The priest's breath caught, his eyes strained to see through the cab's interior. Inside sat a figure draped in fine robes, skin the color of wax, eyes shut as though in gentle repose. The air shimmered around it, distorting the face into something that was and was not human. "Who are you?" Matteo whispered. A faint smile curved the shadow's lips. "Once I was a passenger. Now I am the road." And before Matteo could speak again, the door closed. The carriage began to move, not along the bridge, but through it. The cobblestones turned to water, and the wheels passed silently into the black surface. The priest stumbled back, crossing himself, eyes wide as the cab sank, lanterns fading into the river like drowned stars. Only the echo of hooves remained, faint, rhythmic, receding beneath the bridge. The next morning, the people of Florence awoke to find Father Matteo's cloak hanging from the bridge's railing, wet and torn as though caught by the wind. His body was never recovered, but as the sun set that evening, a carriage was seen once more, gliding silently across the bridge, lanterns glowing with a spectral green hue, and some swore they could see a second shadow beside the driver, the outline of a priest, his hands folded, his lips moving in eternal prayer. From that day, the Bridge of Echoes gained its name. Pilgrims avoided it after dark. Lovers whispered that if you crossed at midnight and spoke the name Matteo, you would hear your own voice repeated, not as an echo, but as a prophecy of your death. And yet, the midnight passenger continued. In the years that followed, the Black Death waned, but stories persisted. Travelers passing through the valleys between Florence and Bologna told of a spectral cab that appeared when the church bells struck 12, a carriage drawn by a horse with silver eyes. It was said that it would stop only for those whose time had come, the ones who walked alone with guilt too heavy for prayer, or hearts too burdened for confession. And once you entered, the door would not open again. Scholars, centuries later, would call these accounts symbolic, a metaphor for mortality during plague years. But one curious document, preserved in the Vatican archives, told otherwise. A letter dated 1375, written by a Benedictine chronicler named Brother Lamberto. "There is a traveler upon the roads of Tuscany," it read. "He does not eat, nor sleep, nor age. He drives a carriage made of iron and glass, with a flame that needs no oil. The dying see him and smile. The living see him and are undone." The letter was sealed, marked with a single wax sigil, a wheel within a circle, flanked by wings. The same sigil was later found carved beneath one of Florence's oldest bridges. Centuries passed. The bridge still stands today, though Florence has changed beyond recognition. Locals call it Ponte dei Sussurri, Bridge of Whispers. Tourists cross it each evening, snapping photographs, unaware of the history beneath their feet. But every now and then, when the air grows to still and the river to quiet, some hear the faint roll of carriage wheels, the jingle of a distant harness, and a voice, low and calm, murmuring, "Where to, my friend?" And if you answer, if you so much as whisper your destination, The next sound you'll hear will be the opening of a door. Chapter 7. The Lantern of San Domenico. The Monastery of San Domenico, perched on the hills overlooking Siena, had always been a quiet place, centuries of prayer echoing softly against its stone walls, thick incense curling in the air like ghosts of devotion. But by the autumn of 1375, the abbey carried a weight heavier than the recent plague. Its crypts were full, its bell tower silent, save for the occasional wind through broken panes. It was here that Matteo di Rossi's tale began to reach the ears of men who lived for knowledge, and the inexplicable Brother Lorenzo's records, hidden beneath piles of dusty manuscripts, told of the Carriage's first appearance on the road from Siena to Florence. But now, reports began to multiply. Peasants, priests, and merchants swore that a pale lantern floated along the roads at midnight, sometimes moving faster than a horse, sometimes hovering over graveyards or deserted bridges. The monks whispered that the lantern was no ordinary flame. Its light, dim and greenish, burned not with oil or wick, but with the essence of lost souls. They called it La Lampa di San Domenico, the Lantern of San Domenico. The witnesses among the first to report it was a young novice named Antonio, who had been tending the abbey's garden. He told of seeing the lantern rising from the mist, floating as if carried by the wind itself, with the silhouette of a cab driver visible in its glow. It halted at the crossroads, he wrote in a hurried hand. A figure emerged, cloaked in black. His face, I cannot describe it. It moved, though his wheels made no sound. I bowed, and the lantern passed me, leaving me trembling. Antonio's confession was corroborated by a traveling merchant, Giovanni, who had lost 3 members of his family to the plague. Giovanni insisted he saw the lantern at the same crossroads, floating above the ruins of a chapel that had long been abandoned. The monks speculated, perhaps the lantern guided the dead, or perhaps it was a warning to the living. But the pattern was undeniable. Where the lantern appeared, misfortune followed. A villager would fall ill, a house would catch fire, or a river would rise suddenly. The ritual of observation, Brother Lorenzo, growing ever more obsessed, began to study the lantern's appearances in conjunction with the abbey's records of deaths, pilgrimages, and roads. He noted that the lantern of San Domenico appeared only on nights when the plague's memory had been freshly stirred. For example, when a grave was disturbed, or a coin from Bernabo Visconti's mint changed hands. Lorenzo hypothesized that the lantern was not merely a ghostly apparition, but a vessel of judgment. He wrote in his journal, "The driver does not take souls randomly. He chooses those who have left debts unpaid, whether in sin or action. The lantern is his guide, illuminating the road for the passenger who has not yet confessed." Matteo's next fare. On a cold November night, nearly a year after his first encounter, Matteo found himself drawn again to the abandoned crossroads. The first snow of the season coated the ground, reflecting the lantern's ghostly glow before he had even seen it. The air was thick with frost and decay. A single coin, blackened and fused like the ones he had cast into the river, lay on the road. He recognized it immediately, another token of Bernabo Visconti, aged beyond reason. Then the lantern appeared, floating above the earth, its light flickering against the bare branches. It cast long shadows that seemed almost alive. The driver emerged from the mist, hands gripping the reins, who'd pulled low over a face that shifted subtly, sometimes human, sometimes the reflection of Matteo's own fears. This time, the passenger was already waiting. A child, pale and silent, eyes wide with terror, sitting alone in the carriage. Matteo's heart clenched. He knew, even without asking, that this soul had been left behind, abandoned during the last plague. He took the reins, hands shaking, as the horse moved forward of its own accord. The lantern floated ahead, guiding them through woods that had no names, over rivers that glimmered with reflections of centuries past. Across the shadowed bridges, the cab traveled across bridges long since crumbled, through towns that no longer existed. Matteo felt the road shift beneath him, one moment cobblestone, the next river, then mist so dense it swallowed the wheels entirely. The child clutched the edge of the seat, silent, staring straight ahead. The lantern pulsed with faint green light, illuminating inscriptions on old stone bridges. Memento vita et memoriam mortis. Remember life and recall death. It was a warning and a truth. The Black Death had left its mark not only on the living, but on the memory of the world itself. Every road, every bridge, every ruined chapel carried whispers of those who had died, and the lantern made them visible to those who dared travel the night. Matteo realized the terrible logic. The driver, the passenger, the lantern, all were bound together. Each appearance was a lesson in guilt and remembrance, a journey that had begun decades ago and would continue for centuries. The arrival, by the first hint of dawn, the carriage reached the edge of a graveyard outside Florence. Snow melted under the lantern's glow, and the child stepped down, pale as frost, but unharmed. The driver turned to Matteo, hood falling back slightly. For a moment, he glimpsed the same hollow eyes, the same shifting face he had seen before, a reminder that some sins are carried, not forgiven. Then the lantern flickered, the carriage vanished, and the world returned to winter sunlight. The graveyard was empty, save for a faint set of wheel marks pressed into the frozen earth, and a single coin, a blackened token of judgment, left for Matteo to carry until the next night. By the time Matteo returned to the village, the whispers had spread. Some said the lantern was a sign of divine mercy. Others whispered it was a curse, a warning of the debt that comes for every life abandoned in fear or greed. And somewhere in the hills, the lantern of San Domenico continued to float, guiding the midnight passenger, waiting for the next fare. And for those who would travel the road between the living and the dead. Chapter 8, The Vanishing Carriage. The year was 1380. Siena had recovered from the worst of the plague, though the memories of death clung to the city like a stubborn fog. Matteo di Rossi, now older, hollow-eyed, and gaunt, had become something of a local ghost himself, a man who rarely spoke, who walked the roads at night alone, and who carried coins that no one else dared touch. Yet the midnight passenger did not rest. The first disappearance, it began subtly. Travelers reported seeing a cab parked at crossroads, its lantern glowing faintly in the mist. But by the time anyone approached, it had vanished, leaving no tracks, no hoofprints, no wheel marks. Some swore they had glimpsed a figure inside, hooded and silent, yet the body seemed immaterial, insubstantial. Matteo felt it first as a shiver in his chest, a weight of absence. One night, after ferrying a young merchant's widow to the graveyard outside Florence, he returned to his own home only to find the carriage was gone. The horses had disappeared. The lantern was nowhere, and in the barn, the wheel itself had vanished, leaving only the faint imprint of iron in the mud. The villagers whispered of curses. Priests murmured of the old sins of Siena. But Matteo knew better. The carriage was becoming part of the legend it carried. Coins that bind each disappearance coincided with a coin left behind, blackened, glowing faintly, heavy with centuries of guilt. Matteo kept them in a pouch around his neck. Over time, he realized their truth. The coins were not merely payment. They were keys, keys that tethered him to the carriage, to the midnight passenger, and to every soul he had ferried since the Black Death. He tried to abandon them again, tossing one into the Arno, burying another beneath a cross. But each time the coin returned. It appeared in his pocket, on the doorstep, or lying in the frozen earth. The carriage itself, he realized, obeyed the coins. Where the coins were, it could appear. Where they were absent, it would vanish. The witness in Florence, on a cold winter's night. A scholar named Lorenzo da Vinci, no relation to the later artist, claimed to have seen the carriage glide silently along Piazza del Duomo, passing beneath the cathedral bells without disturbing the air. The driver, Lorenzo wrote, wore the black robes of a monk, yet the face beneath the hood shifted constantly. One moment a man, the next a skull, the next the reflection of my own fear. A child sat beside him, clutching a coin that glimmered green in the lantern's light. When the carriage passed, the street emptied as though all the souls had fled. By morning, the coin remained on the plaza, untouched, yet warm to the touch. Lorenzo swore never to walk alone at night again. The curse deepens. Matteo came to understand the curse's rhythm. The carriage appeared only at midnight, along roads where the plague had left the heaviest toll. Its lantern glowed, drawing in those who were unconfessed, unrepentant, or bearing guilt. Once inside, the passengers did not speak. Their eyes, wide and hollow, reflected the lives they had lost and the sins they had left unatoned. Some left behind coins, some vanished without a trace. Matteo, bound to his role, drove endlessly. Each night was the same, yet subtly different. The carriage shifted. Sometimes the wheels passed over the mist without sound, sometimes over rivers frozen in shadow. Sometimes the road itself seemed to end, only to reappear beyond a hill or across an invisible bridge, and each time the carriage became more ethereal. Matteo's hands would pass through the reins. The horses' breaths would leave no mist. It was disappearing along with him. The last passenger on a night thick with snow, Matteo ferried what he instinctively knew would be his final passenger, a man dressed in the tattered robes of a plague priest. His face was lined with grief, his hands shaking, clutching a ledger filled with names of the dead. The carriage glided through the dark streets of Siena, across bridges and over roads long forgotten. The lantern shone green, illuminating gravestones and ruins alike. The priest spoke once, voice trembling, "Do you not tire, driver? How long will you carry us?" Matteo's voice was hoarse. "As long as the road exists, as long as there are debts unpaid." The priest's eyes widened. "But the road, it is ending. I see it dissolve beneath us." Matteo looked around. The horses' hooves no longer touched the cobblestones. The lantern's light wavered like a dying ember, and then the carriage itself began to fade. The wheels, the wood, even the hooded driver became less than shadow, as though time itself were erasing it from existence. The priest reached forward. "And you, what becomes of you?" Matteo swallowed. He did not answer. The carriage vanished completely. The echo remains when the villagers of Siena awoke. They found the barn empty. No horses, no carriage, no sign of Matteo di Rossi. Only the coins remained, blackened and glowing faintly, pressed into the dirt like small memorials. The story, however, lived on. Travelers along the old roads spoke of the midnight passenger, a coach that appeared silently, ferrying souls lost to guilt, disease, or fear. Even centuries later, the lantern of San Domenico and the vanished carriage were recorded in parish annals, traveler journals, and folklore. Coins bearing the Visconti mark surfaced from time to time, often in the hands of the unwary or the curious, carrying the weight of Matteo's curse across generations. And every midnight, when the fog rolled thick over Siena and Florence, some claim they can hear the faint jingle of harness bells and the soft whisper of a voice. Where to, my friend? Chapter 9. The Coins of Bernabo Visconti. The year was 1361. Bernabo Visconti, the infamous Lord of Milan, ruled with a hand both cruel and calculating, known for his brutal taxation, relentless expansion, and merciless justice. He was also rumored to have delved into the occult, seeking ways to extend life, control fate, and bend the will of men. Among his court's treasures were coins of silver and blackened alloy, minted under strange rites. Chroniclers wrote that these coins were not merely currency, but vessels, containers for intention, guilt, and debt. The alchemical origin Visconti's court employed alchemists who experimented with transmutation, not only of metals, but of the human soul. According to the records of a cloistered monk, Master Giacomo di Legnano, these coins were imbued with the essence of a soul in debt, created through rituals involving blood, wax, and prayers twisted into invocations. The coin, Legnano wrote, must be struck with intent. It carries the weight of the giver's sin, the fear of the receiver, and the judgment of the Lord. He who touches it knowingly invites the bearer of the coin, the ferryman, to claim their due. It is said Matteo di Rossi first encountered such a coin while driving along plague-ridden roads. Each coin he had picked up, dropped, or attempted to discard carried this burden, compelling him to ferry souls who had been abandoned in both death and life. The Visconti curse. Bernabo was aware, perhaps, that his coins could extend influence beyond death. Legends claim he distributed them carefully, giving them to tax collectors, guards, and merchants who had proved particularly loyal or particularly ruthless. Those who came into possession of the coins often suffered strange fates. Merchants found their caravans lost to spectral fire. Soldiers vanished mid-battle, leaving armor behind. Priests reported visions of ghostly carriages, lanterns hovering over their parishes. The coins became synonymous with unsettled debts, spiritual, moral, and financial. They were keys to the midnight passenger, each one marking a soul yet to be ferried, the scholar's discovery. In 1470, a scholar named Alessandro di Conti documented an unusual observation in the archives of Milan. Certain coins, struck by the Visconti, bear not merely value, but intent. Those who carry them without reverence are marked by fate. Some vanish from their homes. Others appear in places long abandoned. I have seen a coin glow faintly in the dark, and the air chill around it, though the room is full of warmth. What power resides in these small pieces of metal is beyond comprehension. Alessandro's manuscripts were later seized by the Inquisition, though fragments survived. Within them was a diagram depicting a black coin surrounded by symbols of death, wheels, and flames. the same sigils that appeared in Matteo di Rossi's Chronicles centuries later. Matteo's role, it became clear that Matteo, by fate or design, had been bound to the coins. Each coin carried a debt, a soul that needed passage. Every night he drove the carriage. The coin's power tethered him to the mortal plane. But there was more. The coins were cumulative. Those who handled them repeatedly, like Matteo, became less human, more spectral. Witnesses described seeing him, once a living man, now a shadow at the reins, pale, insubstantial, voice hollow. The coins themselves were self-protecting. Attempts to destroy them, melting, burying, or tossing into rivers failed. Each coin would return to the owner or appear where it was most needed for the ferryman to claim his due. Historical crossovers records show that in cities like Venice, Florence, and Siena, coins believed to be Visconti soul coins appeared long after the Lord's death. Some were discovered in merchant ledgers, others in abbey treasuries, and some even in the pockets of plague victims, as if the coins themselves had chosen who to mark next. The midnight passenger legend, it seems, was a natural consequence. A man, Matteo di Rossi, bound to these coins, forced to ferry souls across a road that blurred the living and dead, became a cautionary tale spread across Italy and Europe. By the late 15th century, stories had multiplied. A merchant in Venice wrote of a green-lit lantern on the Grand Canal. A priest in Bologna swore a hooded driver ferried souls past the city gates. Travelers along the Via Francigena avoided crossroads where coins had been lost, convinced that touching one invited the midnight passenger. The lesson of the coins, centuries later, historians and folklorists would debate the origin and purpose of these coins. Some claimed they were merely plague tokens, used to mark deaths or debts. Others argued they were a curse of Bernabo Visconti, a cruel extension of his power into eternity. But one truth remained. Wherever the coins appeared, the carriage followed. The midnight passenger continued his nightly journey, unseen by most, known to a few, and feared by those who glimpsed even a fragment of his presence. Matteo di Rossi's penance had become eternal, bound by coins, by guilt, and by the plague's shadow. He drove endlessly, ferrying souls whose sins had been left unatoned, appearing wherever history had left a crack between life and death. And the coins, blackened, glowing faintly, heavy with centuries of debt, waited quietly for the next hand to touch them. Chapter 10. The final crossing. The year was 1387. Siena, still scarred from the plague decades earlier, lay under a pale moon. Roads that had once carried the sick and dying now carried only shadows. Fog drifted low over the countryside, curling around cottages, graveyards, and abandoned chapels. On one such road, a lone carriage appeared. Its lantern glowed green, flickering like a dying ember. The driver, Matteo di Rossi, had grown more shadow than man. His robes hung in tatters, his face hollow, yet the eyes retained a flicker of recognition. For every soul ferried, every coin collected, every night spent crossing the boundary between life and death had left an imprint upon him. Inside the carriage sat the last passenger Matteo would ever carry, a young girl, no older than 10, clutching a blackened coin. Her eyes were wide, but not fearful. They reflected trust, or perhaps resignation. The silent journey, the carriage moved without sound, rolling over roads that had long ceased to exist on maps. Bridges rose and fell like the backs of slumbering beasts. Ghostly lanterns lit ruins of towns that had been abandoned, the fog parting like breath for a path unseen. Matteo held the reins, though the horse's hooves made no contact with the earth. The lantern, pulsing gently, illuminated inscriptions on stone bridges and gates. Memento vita, et memoriam mortis. Remember life and recall death. The girl did not speak. She did not move. Matteo understood that her fate had already been determined. She would cross into the afterlife, her coin marking her passage, her soul bound briefly to the midnight passenger until the debt was absolved. The last fare, as the carriage ascended a hill shrouded in mist, Matteo felt something shift. The roads themselves began to dissolve beneath the wheels, the lantern's light flickering as if unsure of where to guide him. He realized with dawning clarity his own journey was ending. The coins, centuries of debt and sin, glowed in his pocket. Each one hummed with the memory of the lives he had ferried. The very essence of the midnight passenger, a man bound to duty and curse, was being undone. He looked at the girl. In her eyes, he saw what he had long sought: release. The coins had done their work. Souls were delivered. Debts had been carried. And now the road itself was ready to reclaim him. The dissolution, the carriage reached a bridge that shimmered in moonlight, a bridge that did not exist on any map. Matteo sensed it as a liminal space, the boundary between mortal life and eternity. He drove forward, lantern glowing faintly, and with each step his body became less substantial. His hands passed through the reins. The horse became a wisp of smoke. The wheels left no mark. The girl stood and stepped down from the carriage. Matteo called to her, voice echoing like a fading wind. Farewell. May your journey be peaceful. She turned once, smiled faintly, and vanished into the mist, leaving only a single blackened coin on the bridge. Matteo picked it up, feeling the weight of all the others he had carried over centuries. And then, with the softest sigh, the carriage, the horse, the lantern, and Matteo himself dissolved into nothingness, the echoes left behind. By morning, the villagers who lived near the old road found only traces of the journey. A faint glow on the bridge where the lantern had been the imprint of wheels on the frost that quickly melted, and a single black coin resting in the snow. Stories of the midnight passenger persisted, whispered from generation to generation. Travelers claimed to hear the faint jingle of harness bells, or see a shadow at the edge of the fog. Scholars debated the history, tracing it back to plague years, Visconti coins, and monastic chronicles. Yet Matteo's story had ended. His penance was complete. The carriage would appear no more, though the coins remained. Silent reminders of lives remembered, debts carried, and souls delivered. And as you lay your head down tonight, remember the roads less traveled, the bridges shrouded in mist, and the lanterns that guide the lost. Not all journeys are physical. Some are echoes of the past, shadows that linger in memory, and whispers of history that refuse to fade. Here at Tranquil Arc Chronicles, endless horrories for sleepless nights, we invite you to listen closely to the silence, to hear the tales that time has almost forgotten, and to rest knowing that even the most haunted souls eventually find peace. Close your eyes. Imagine the quiet road, the green glow fading into the mist, and the gentle rhythm of wheels that will roll forever only in memory.